Welcome, dear students. In this session, I'm going to talk about borrowings in Middle English. I hope by the end of this session, you will have an understanding of the nature of borrowings in Middle English. Well, popular and literary borrowings both were found in Middle English. In fact, my dear students, a large proportion of the words were borrowed from French language. These words were thoroughly popular amongst the people. They were in layman use and they were a part of the usage of everyday life. These words were brought from French that was being used by the nobility of the times into the English language that was being used by middle class at that time. These words were hundreds in numbers. They made a major part of the vocabulary of Middle English as, taken from the usage. What happened now? Because they were taken from the everyday use, their entry into the English language was far easier. Their entry also happened through certain literary texts. In fact, if we look at the literary texts, if we look at the literature, we would find that throughout the times, literature served as a channel for the shifting or for the movement of words from French language into English language. However, when we come to the 15th century, particularly in this century, this movement was very significant, and the pieces of literature became a principal source for this shifting. Thus, we can say, as far as borrowings are concerned, literature was a means of transfer. Middle English literature was basically directed, and it was directly related to the French origins. So this was another reason that there were a lot of words that were taken from French language. There were a lot of translations that were done in the Middle English period from French to English. Now, there were certain words while the translators would find difficulty with, or they would think that the English words would not convey the meanings as suitably as the French words would. So those words would be borrowed. So, for instance, my dear students, if you look at the screen, you would find certain words that betray learned or bookish origin, and they are used even now in our language very regularly. Notice the words on the screen: adolescence, affability, cohort, combustion, destitution, immensity, pacification, representation, and sumptuous. We all use these words even today in modern English without knowing the origin. Well, my dear students, during the Middle English period, all the borrowings that were made into English language were not from French language. There were some borrowings from Latin language as well. However, if we compare the frequency of borrowings between French and Latin languages as they were borrowed into English, we can notice that the Latin borrowings were far lesser in number. They were far lesser in number for a couple of reasons. A, because they were less popular. Latin language was not in use to that an extent as was French language, especially when it comes to the spoken language. Latin language was not in that much currency as was the French language. So, another important difference between the borrowings from French and Latin languages was that whereas the French language borrowings came through both the channels, mainly from, the popular oral channel, the spoken language, plus the literary channel or through the literature. In the case of Latin language, most of the borrowings came only through writing. Of course, there were reasons for that. Latin was not spoken by common people. It was spoken among men of learning and of ecclesiastics and the people who were, belonging to courts, and most of the times it was restricted to religion. So, certain words came directly into English language from these domains of life. Small in comparison to entering into English language when we look at them in comparison with, the French language borrowings. Here I would give the example of a single work. The work is of Trevisa. It is actually the translation of a work, and I have underlined here for you the name of this work. If we look at this work, we would find several hundred Latin borrowings that were made. In fact, my dear students, 14th and 15th centuries were especially prolific in Latin borrowings. To sum this point up, how these Latin and French borrowings were affecting English and why they were needed, I would quote an anonymous writer of early 15th century who says, I am pointing it out on the screen for you. It is not easy to translate, he says, from Latin into English. And what is the reason that he gives? That there are certain Latin terms for which the writers or the translators do not find suitable equivalents. He says, there is, by the way, this is. There is many words in Latin that we have no proper English according thereto. So, the writers of the times admitted that sometimes these borrowings were needed because, for the simple reason that the words that could convey the same meaning were not available in English language.